So here is a question from our Facebook group that came through. So it says, my child was recently diagnosed with autism and dysgraphia through an evaluation outside of the school. However, my partner is worried that if we tell the school and they put this in my daughter's record, it might influence her ability to get accepted into certain colleges or earn scholarships. Is that something that we should avoid?
So it's kind of a layered question. So I think the first part of the question or part of this premise is if they tell the high school she's attending, will that go into the record? So with the caveat that I am not a lawyer or a doctor, and this is not legal or medical advice, my understanding from a lawyer friend of mine is that transcripts cannot say anything about a student having, they don't have asterisks that say, for instance, Elizabeth had an IEP or Elizabeth had a 504 plan. And they can't identify, and again, I'm hopefully not botching this, a class as being a special class unless the curriculum was modified. So if I took a self-contained math class, it could be identified as such on my transcript. If I was in general ed classes, let's say where there's a co-teacher, that will not be identified on my transcript. Now, what does get tricky, and I don't know what the answer is to this, is sometimes students attend a period a day in in the 90s when I taught in high school was called the Learning Center. I believe they can still do that, and it seems like that would identify a student as having a disability. So, you'd have to talk to whoever does the transcripts at your school. So that's the first part of it. So there would be nothing on the transcript except in those situations that I've described. Now, when students apply to colleges, they'll notice that there's no place where colleges ask them about having a disability because they're not allowed to. That said, students who want to can disclose their disability. There are no numbers on how many students every year are accepted to or rejected from a university who disclosed their disability or who didn't disclose their disability. The only kinds of numbers we have at college are those who actually identified themselves to the disability services offices because they're the only ones we can count. But all of this is to say, students, anecdotally, I have heard lots of stories of students who disclosed their disabilities and were accepted everywhere they wanted to go. But certainly students don't have to, but I would not assume it would be a negative to have the disability identified in any way. But what's important is the self-determination of the student in deciding what she would like to do when she applies to colleges.
Another question that we have here, it says, I'm worried that if we call and ask the university about services and supports, that it will lessen my son's chances of getting accepted into his school of choice, or that they will only have a certain number of spots for kids who need extra support. So what is the best way to contact the school or find answers to those types of questions without hurting his chances of being accepted?
Oh boy, this question comes up every once in a while, but this person has added a new element that in all these many years I've not heard before, was the idea that there are only a certain number of spots available to students with disabilities. So it makes my heart hurt a little bit that, again, families are worried about even asking questions. And so let me try to frame this in a way I hope will make them feel better. If you were to call the Disability Services Office at Hamlet University to ask questions about our supports, why would I then call the admissions office? Because if you don't come to my college and nobody gets in with a disability, I'm out of a job. So I recognize I don't want to be dismissive of parents' concerns, and they hear all sorts of things from people. Again, many of which can't be supported by any data. And I do want to remind people of these things about, students aren't getting into this college with a disability. Nobody has those numbers, I assure you. And remember, even if Hamlet University counted the number of students who got in who disclosed their disability when they applied, that number would only represent those students and not the students who decided to write about their passion for baking bread instead of their disability when they applied. So I very sympathetic to families' concerns, but here's the thing. First of all, you should be calling the Disability Services Office, not the admissions office, because you cannot be sure that the admissions office really knows anything about the supports. So go directly to us. But, I can't speak to every single one of my colleagues. I just don't see a scenario where we would ask for your name and then transmit that up to the admissions office. I mean, it would be a dereliction or a violation of our rules. I mean, there are no specific rules, but just of our ethos. Why would we do that? And also, again, we'd be putting ourselves out of a job. But I think I want to encourage families to contact our offices and ask questions. I had said earlier in the interview that on my website, there's a form you can download to help guide your research in looking at disability services offices. And if you can't find the information you're seeking, I encourage you to contact the Disability Services Office, because we want students to come whose needs we can meet. And so if, you're asking for a lot of the modifications that you and I discussed in this interview, and that's a deal breaker, you should have that information. And, we're probably going to say something like, we always have to consider a request. We're not supposed to ever make a blanket, we don't do that kind of statement. But we can at least give you a sense of, gee, that's something I don't ever know we have approved, or we only approve it for a certain number of students. Or, oh yeah, it's no big deal at our school at all. And so ask those questions. And if it makes you truly uncomfortable and I can't reassure you, give us a fake name. Call from a friend's cell phone. I mean, do it on Zoom, whatever, Google Meets. But on what some might see a negative point, colleges are not reserving a certain number of slots every year for students with disabilities. There's no quota of students we have to admit. And so the idea, and this circles back to the disclosure piece, do not force a student who doesn't want to disclose their disability when applying to college under the assumption that we have to admit a certain number of students with disabilities. That's just absolutely not true. But the reverse is also not true. That what it means is also there's no limit on how many students with disabilities we can admit. So that should be reassuring. Now, the only limit that you should be aware of is if your student wants to go to a school that has a fee-based learning disabilities program or autism support program or whatever it is. Many of those do have limits. They can only serve a certain number of students. At many of them, you don't even apply to the program until you've been accepted to the college. You can't even apply until that point. An exception to that I'm aware of is Curry College in Massachusetts. But otherwise, you wouldn't. Once your student is accepted to that school, though, they should immediately apply to the LD program because they do not have to expand capacity just to meet the needs. So that's the only exception, and that's only in those very specific spaces. But that doesn't also, have anything to do with whether or not they get into the college.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.